Hello guys, welcome back. We have already talked about the introduction to ethics and the ethical obligations as a researcher. And in the third part of today's session, we are going to look at the ethics in practice and what we should do as a researcher to be able to fit the ethical codes and guidelines, especially when you are thinking about your dissertation, what you should do. And yeah, it's not only about your dissertation, it is about we try to cover as much as possible on different types of research. All right, let's look at the details. Okay, I think you could all see this slide, which shows the ethical issues across different stages of the research. This is a screenshot from one of the core textbooks from Saunders. And in that textbook, they have a designated chapter on ethical issues, on ethical considerations. As you can see in this graph, they have considered the ethical issues across different stages, right at the beginning of when you try to formulate a research question, and when you try to design your research, when you try to gain access, when you try to collect your data, and after collecting your data, when you analyze the data, and finally, when you write up. So there are various ethical issues that we should consider across different stages. Well, the most common thing that we would usually consider is usually concerned in the data collection procedure. So the reason I want to show you this image is that I want to make you awareness of the fact that ethical issues does not only occur in the data collection procedure, it also occurs in other procedures as well. And I will talk about some of the most commonly used practice in the ethical, when we are dealing with the ethical issues, or when we try to prevent any ethical issues. Okay, one of the most popular practice that we do when we conduct the research is to implement an informed consent. The informed consent is that we need to make sure that the participants understand about the nature of our research, and the participants understand what rights that they have and what protection that they would have, how we are going to deal with their data, how we are going to publicize their data, etc. So it is about when we're trying to implement informed consent, what we're usually do is to do two things. One is the information sheet, and the other one is a consent form, although you could combine the two. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of a separated format, which is an information sheet and a consent form. Here, another thing I want to address here is the role of the gatekeeper. Not sure you have come across the gatekeeper concept before, this term. The the gatekeeper refers to someone who introduces you to your participants or to the organization that you want to study. So a gatekeeper could be somebody who already works in the company that you want to research on. For example, a HR manager in the organization that you want to study. Or it could be somebody who knows someone in the organization. And they could be someone you know or someone you do not know, but introduced by someone you know. It sounds complicated, but anyway, a gatekeeper may impact on your informed consent because, for example, if this gatekeeper has the power on your research participants, it is possible that your research participants choose to participate in your research because of the power of the gatekeeper. In that case, these participants are not participating in your project in a voluntary nature, but more or less kind of a result of a power force. In that case, even if they sign a consent form, we do have a question of how voluntary they are and how much protection that they can get in this research. So in your dissertation or in any other type of research that you want to do in the future, if you do have a gatekeeper thinking about their role, and when you plan your research, think about their role and any potential impact that their role may bring to your research or to your research participants. Okay, here I have put two examples. On the left-hand side of the slide is an example of information sheet. And on the right-hand side is a consent form. It's an example of consent form. We will look at these two in much detail in the next slide. Okay, so this is a zoom in of the information sheet. As we can see from this example, so here the information sheet includes these couple of information: the title of the research, the name of the researcher, the aim of the research, and how the research finding would be produced or would be reported. And then they have also include how the research would be published. Okay. What kind of rights the participants would have. And in this example of the consent form, there are some information which are quite similar to the information sheet, which include the research title, the name of the researcher, and quite importantly here in the consent form is to list out all the rights that your research participants would have and how you are going to handle the data. For example, where you would like to store your data, whether you want to take a recording of the interview, and how can participants approach you if they have any questions or if they want to change their access to the data. Okay. And by the end of a consent form, we usually would leave some space for signature between the researcher and the participant. So each participant would have a consent form like this. Usually, we would recommend students to have a written form of the consent form. But if circumstances doesn't allow, for example, if you are doing an interview remotely and because of the pandemic, well, you can always do a verbal consent if you cannot do a written consent. So a verbal consent is you verbally introduces the rights that your participant would have, and then you can ask them whether they would like to proceed to your research by knowing their rights and by knowing how you are going to handle the data and store the data. And if they say yes, that can also be taken as their informed consent. All right. Another commonly used practice in research ethics is confidentiality. Confidentiality is that we try to not exposing information about the participant to the audience, whether to the academic community or to the public. A commonly used way to keep confidentiality is to anonymize the name of the participant. Anonymizing is that we could use a code. For example, if you're doing interviews, you could say interviewee A, interviewee B, interviewee C, and etc. That is one way to anonymize the name of your participant. Or you could also give them code like X101 or Z04. So you can give them a code to refer to a particular participant. And there are other ways besides anonymity. You can also use pseudonyms. Pseudonyms is where you can use a fake name and to cover their real name. So for example, if a person is called Julia, if one of your participants is called Julia, you may use another name such as Yolanda to cover the real name of your participant, so that nobody would tell who exactly you are talking, so that their information is covered, is kept confidential. Okay. So confidentiality, yeah, most commonly used way is anonymity, and we should keep the confidentiality when we analyze the data and when we report the data. Try your best not to expose the information that your interviewees or any other type of participants do not want to expose. If they want to expose, that's another story. But in the case that they do not want to expose their name, and not only their name, sometimes the organization that you study do not want the name of their organization to be exposed. And in that way, you also need to anonymize the name of the organization. For example, if you want to study this university, instead of putting the name of the university, if you do not have the permission, And one way to put it is you could say this research is conducted in a Russell Group university, or you could say this research is conducted in a university in North England, so that somehow, it tells the way how you describe about this organization, tells the nature of the organization, but not necessarily exposing the name of the organization. So the name of the organization can still be covered. Okay. And there are other things that we would also think about on the practice. Well, less commonly well known compared to the previous two. This research integrity is also need to be bear in mind that as a researcher, there are certain obligations that we need to do. We need to be honest. We need to give credit to the authors that helped us. So, for example, if you have a co-authorship, we need to be honest on, the contribution of each author and who else have helped on your research project. And there are some bad practice. For example, here in the slide, I have mentioned two authorships. One is called gift authorship. The other one is called gold authorship. The gift authorship is gift authorship means that some authors listed on the publication are not contributing. They appear in the list of authors because it is kind of a exchange of a gift. Like maybe when you publish a paper, you would give a co-authorship to one of your friends. And when this friend is publishing a paper, they would add your name as a co-author, and that is a typical way of gift authorship. And well, that's not a good practice. I do not recommend you to do that. And the same for the ghost authorship, which somebody apparently does not make enough contribution to be a co-author, but their name is appeared on the paper and for various reasons. Okay. Well, what we suggest here is to try your best to be an ethical researcher with integrity. Okay, and another thing is during your writing up process. So after you have collected your data, analyzed your data, when you are writing up, we need to make sure that we cite people properly, we quote people properly, and we do not misinterpret any of the meanings from your research participants intentionally, at least. And a good practice would be you have a double up, you have a peer who would help you to check your interpretation of how you understand from your research participants. Okay, and make sure that you are clear about primary referencing and secondary referencing. So there, the example in the final point on this slide is an example of secondary referencing. So here it means that you have read the article from Hardy instead of you have read the original paper written by Ford. So here is an example showing that instead of reading the original piece of work by Ford, you actually only knew about Ford's work from Hardy's paper. By this case, it'll be good that if you make it clear where you have read this piece of research, rather than claiming you have read the original publication by Ford, which is actually a lie. Okay, so these are some tips, or these are some good practice we should follow, or some of the practice that we should avoid. Okay, so for your dissertation, and I know dissertation would be probably your most important piece of research that you would do and throughout your life. Hopefully not, and hopefully you would do other type of research as well. For your dissertation, there are a couple of things that you can do on ethical considerations. One is, whenever you feel you are not sure your ethical obligations, or what you should do about the ethics in your dissertation, you can always discuss it with your dissertation supervisor. Okay, and we always recommend students to think about the potential ethical issues that your dissertation may occur right at the beginning of your dissertation process. And in your dissertation piece of work, and in the methodology chapter, you have to write one section on ethical considerations. So what the potential ethical issues that your dissertation may face, and after you're finishing those procedures like data collection and data analysis, and after you're finishing these processes, you need to also reflect on how well you have practiced these points that you have raised in that particular section. Okay, and in that, we don't have a word limit in that section in your dissertation. Whereas for the summative assessment for this module, the research method module, well, we do have a word limit. Your module leader will tell you more about it when they introduce the assessment to you. Okay, so here in this slide, you would see a list of questions that you should think of when you are planning out your dissertation, including, what the potential, for example, what the potential harms that your dissertation may bring to your participants, and how you're going to inform your participants on their rights, and how you're going to handle the data, how you're going to store the data. Okay, these are the things that you should consider at the very beginning of your dissertation process. If you have any doubt about these questions, you can discuss it with your dissertation supervisor. All right, and we come to the end of today's lecture on research ethics. Well, a couple of key messages that I want to readdress. The first one is, so all forms of research would require you to think about the potential ethical issues that your research may bring to any parties, probably not only your participants, but to others as well, and to yourself, as we mentioned earlier in our second part of today's lecture. And the ethical codes or ethical practice is not always fixed. We always encourage you to be reflective on what particular ethical issues that your particular dissertation or your particular piece of research may bring. Okay, so it's not always the same thing that we would follow. We need to consider the speciality of our particular piece of research. And about ethical obligations, we have put them into 4 categories: 1 to society and the law, 1 to research participants. Hope you still remember them, that we should always protect our participants. We should always give them rights, do not harm them. We should take care of vulnerable groups. And for sponsors, founders, and clients, we should negotiate a lot of things, particularly on responsibilities and duties or rights that you would have, or the clients or the sponsors would have. And to yourself and to your colleagues and to other scholars, we need to be an honest and a high research integrity researcher. Okay, and finally, on the ethical practice, what we always suggest you to do are some of the common practices that we would usually use in ethics. And the first message is that ethics is not only on the data collection, although the data collection procedure is usually the most kind of obvious procedure that we should consider. But here I want to readdress the importance of other stages as well. So ethical issues should be considered across different stages of a research project. And some of the commonly used practice, one is informed consent, where we have looked at an example of information sheet and the consent form. So here, basically, we need to make sure that your research participants understand the nature of your research, as well as their rights. Okay. And about confidentiality, we should keep confidentiality, keep the information confidential. That information usually includes the name of your research participant and name of the organization that you study. A common way of keeping confidentiality is to anonymize their name, or you could use pseudonyms. And another thing that we should do is how we handle the data and store the data. We should make sure that we would store the data in a safe place. We do not upload it on the public place, for example. And another thing, and I also want to remind you, is in the data analysis and the writing up procedure, please make sure that you do not misinterpret any information that your participants has brought to you. Okay, right. That's it of the lecture on research ethics. I hope you now have more understanding on research ethics and what you can do to follow the ethical code or ethical obligations. All right, I'll see you in the next lecture.